Ah yes, nothing better than the continuous display of misinformation from people who pretend to be experts or authority figures in order to mislead the public on the situation of COVID-19. This literally fuels my existence. I live for this!
On both sides of the aisle, people acknowledge that one of the biggest problems during the COVID pandemic was the failure of public health.
Now the thing is, I do agree to some extent. I think we did very little in terms of actually preparing for the pandemic. A lot of what we could have done stems from what we should have done before the pandemic started, from increasing funding for public health, increasing communication efforts, collect better real-time data for sharing, and setting up better isolation facilities, etc. But of course, I have a feeling that what I think could have been done better is different than what you think could have been done better. So although we agree that more could have been done, we don't agree fundamentally on what that is, because if we agreed, I wouldn't be making this video.
Public health waffled. Public health stated facts when they didn't know facts.
Stated facts when it didn't know facts? Okay, but even if you didn't know it, a fact is by definition something that is true, right? Whatever, I'm tired of trying to make sense of everything people say because a lot of the time it just doesn't make sense. It's so true that Americans can't even speak their own language correctly sometimes.
Public health, arguably, some of the scientific bureaucrats that seem to grab hold of the reins, probably more than anybody realizes, actually did engage in disinformation. And please remember the difference between disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation is sharing something that you may well believe today to be absolutely true and established, but next week or next month it's demonstrated to not be the case. In other words, it wasn't intended to mislead. It was simply information that turned out to not be the case. Disinformation, look it up on Merriam-Webster, you're talking about deliberately misleading.
Okay, sure, I guess we can use that definition. So at the end of the day, it's about intent. I suppose that's a pretty useful distinction. That being said, in terms of information that scientists have given to the public, there was actually very few factually incorrect information. Many things ended up being true upon further research, or the original claim was not a definite one. I mean, that's just how science works. When there's a new thing such as a virus, we know very little about it at first. So any initial research projects often end by saying more research is required or certain things need to be peer-reviewed to reach a more definite conclusion. And scientists are aware of this as well. Early research on something new is never going to be taken as straight-away fact, but rather lays the foundation for future research to build upon it and either prove it true or false later on down the line. Meanwhile, on the other hand, early research that did conclude more definitively tended to be true as well, things like vaccination efficacy, mask usage, or the origin of the virus, for example. But again, I think we're thinking of different things here, so let's continue on with the video, shall we?
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya out of Stanford recently released something on Twitter where he said what happened was a group of highly placed scientific bureaucrats grabbed a hold of the reins and decided that they were going to unilaterally basically establish what science was and that this was a problem. And he felt that public health failed more than any other sector.
What even is, quote, highly placed scientific bureaucrats? Please define that for me and tell me who they are. Because I certainly don't know a highly placed scientific bureaucrat, much less know that such a position existed. I mean, sure, you have some scientists who are relatively well known that hold a lot of power in terms of portraying scientific information, such as Dr. Fauci, but they're not bureaucrats by any stretch. At the end of the day, the scientific method relies on individual scientists, the people who pour their heart and souls into the research and knowledge we have today. The scientific consensus is one of the most important concepts in science, where knowledge is essentially determined by the consensus of scientists, proven by peer-reviewed research. No one scientist can sway the scientific consensus, not even Dr. Fauci, because even if a powerful figure in science were to try to mislead the public, they would be shut down by criticism and corrections from the rest of the scientific community. So in large, the information shared by public health officials are usually in consensus to the rest of the community, which is what makes science so powerful. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is a perfect system, it most definitely is not, but in the matter of COVID, we have been pretty consistent in the types of information given to the public. In this case, there is no, quote, highly placed scientific bureaucrats.
And now public health is doubling down on some of their mistakes. Public health is not responding to what we seem to know today.
Okay, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, please stop saying public health as if that's like an entity or organization. Public health is just the health of the public. I know you're trying to use that word to be vague on who you're talking about, but I'm sure everyone would appreciate it if you were more specific.
What have we seen emerge over the last 3 months that we could perhaps all sort of agree on? One, masks do not prevent you from getting the disease. They will filter at some level. But if you tell someone wear a mask, you won't get the disease, you're lying and you're putting them at risk.
Okay, I agree masks won't definitively prevent you from getting the disease, but no one has ever claimed that. The information given has always been that masks can slow down the spread of COVID-19 or that they can decrease your chances of spreading COVID, but no one has ever claimed that masks will 100% prevent you from catching COVID. You're just strawmanning here.
Second thing, natural immunity is as good or better than vaccinated immunity.
That's definitely not something agreed upon in science. In fact, the consensus is the opposite for COVID. Vaccinated immunity is better than natural. I've made 1 or 2 videos on this topic in the past, so I won't reiterate again, but the main point is that vaccines can target specific epitopes or antigens such as the spike protein, which is a better target than if your natural immunity were to make general antibodies for all the antigens of a virus. This has been proven in multiple different research papers, so I'd like to move beyond this if possible.
Transmission can't be stopped with the mRNA vaccines, in large part because the virus gets a chance to collect and replicate in the nasopharynx and not really get exposed to the blood products that involve our immune system.
What? It's certainly true that vaccines don't 100% stop transmission, I think that's been well established, but it can certainly help decrease transmission and protect you and those around you, which is the point of vaccines. I don't know what in the world you were talking about regarding the virus replicating in the pharynx without being exposed to the immune defense system in the blood. That just sounds like complete bogus. But the reason someone can still be infected by the virus and then give it to others even if they're vaccinated is because vaccines are not 100% effective, not because of the immune system not being able to reach your pharynx.
Here's another one. This was at the a cardiology convention, diagnostic and interventional cardiology, about 7 months ago. They were talking about coronavirus. This is 7 months ago. A cardiologist said this, Dr. Lin, he said, what we suspect is that the spike protein has unknown pathological roles. In other words, what he was saying was, leave the COVID virus aside, just the spike protein seems to have a certain pathogenicity or an ability to cause a disease or a pathology or an irregularity or an abnormality. He says, our data show that the spike protein from COVID-19 causes heart muscle damage. And here's the kicker. And then he says this, that's why it's important to get vaccinated and prevent this disease. That doesn't make any sense. He just got done speaking at a conference saying, we now think the spike protein alone, not connected to a virus, the spike protein alone is causing problems. And this has been very well established. And he uses that as a reason to get an mRNA vaccine that will provide the instructions to create spike protein on an endless basis, such that we now know that spike protein is being deposited in various tissues of the human body. This is what's frightening so many scientists and physicians.
I don't know how you can even be in this field of biology and still think that mRNA vaccines create free-floating spike proteins and release it into your blood. First of all, the free spike protein by itself is not harmful. Without other proteins to follow up or any genetic material to inject into the victim cell, there is no harm. If you don't believe me, I'll leave a link in the comments section. But for the sake of argument, let's say they are harmful. Now, if we were talking about traditional vaccines, yes, you'll have inactivated free-floating antigens in your blood, injected directly through the needle as part of the vaccine. But your complaint here is about mRNA vaccines, which doesn't even do that. Upon first glance, it's easy to think that the mechanism works like this, that cells intake the mRNA, produces the spike protein, then release it to float around in the blood until eventually an antigen-presenting cell picks it up and sends the information to a helper T cell. But that's actually not what happens. The mRNA works very locally, meaning that all action generally stays around the site of injection. Any mRNA that leaves this area is degraded very quickly. The cells near the site of injection take up the mRNA and creates the inactive spike protein, but this spike protein isn't just freely released into the blood, but rather it stays in the cell and is attached to the surfaces by an MHC protein. This presentation then goes the normal path where helper T cells come and recognize the antigen, which is presented to the adaptive immune system. In other words, these spike proteins aren't just allowed to freely roam the rest of your body through your blood. It stays in the local area attached to the local cells. So even if free-floating spike proteins are dangerous, it wouldn't really have an effect from the mRNA vaccines. If anyone wants more information regarding this, I'll be leaving some additional links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.